evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Jersey City Education Association. Tonight we're sponsoring a sort of a 101 on school funding. You've heard this in the news from both sides of the aisle in Trenton, from both Democrats and Republicans, that the school funding formula needs to be looked at, needs to be tweaked. You have some politicians out there saying that Jersey City is being subsidized by the rest of the state, while the mayor continues to generously give away tax abatements. And then you have folks on the other side of the spectrum that are saying that we are still underfunded here in Jersey City. There are a lot of plans out there in play right now. There are a lot of proposals out there on what to do with school funding. It's being looked at, it's being examined, it's a hot issue. It's not going to go away, as we know. Locally, we're facing a revaluation of property here in Jersey City. How does that affect us as taxpayers, as residents of this city? How will it affect the folks who are living in abated properties versus traditional homeowners that are paying traditional conventional taxes? That's what the debate at home that is raging. And of course, it's a topic in this gubernatorial election. So we have some folks with us tonight. I'll allow them to introduce themselves, but just going from your left to right, we have Osomo Thomas, who's with us from New Jersey Education Association. He's part of the Government Relations Division. We have Monet Johnson from Educational Law Center, who is an advocate, and they're like a watchdog agency, and I'll let her explain more what she does with public finances and public schooling and charter schooling. We have Bridget D'Souza, who's a very active parent in Jersey City. She's a blogger. She's a Civic JC parent? Civic Parent JC. Community activist. She's at our Board of Ed meetings. She's an outspoken advocate of children in schools. And lastly, we have Amir with us, who is going to speak about an analysis of the budget, the Board of Education budget that he had conducted a few months back. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to our guests, and thank you to our panelists for being here. So Osomo, if you just want to start off and introduce yourself.
I am Osomo Thomas. As Durrani said, I work for the New Jersey Education Association. Specifically, I work in the Government Relations Division there, so I'm a lobbyist. The issues that I work on are school funding, state budget, state takeover, and charter schools. Share that with another colleague. Prior to that, though, I worked in the New Jersey legislature for approximately 15 years, consistently working on education policy and school funding for all those years. Worked in the Senate Majority Office for 4 years or so as the Assistant Budget Director and as aide to the Senate Education Committee.
My name is Monet Johnson. I am the Research Associate at the Education Law Center. The Education Law Center does advocacy and legal work for New Jersey and increasingly national work. As a research assistant, I support all of the litigation and the advocacy we do. So that could be around a lot of school funding stuff, but also we have cases about special education in Flint. We have cases going on with graduation and park regulations, and just a whole myriad of other advocacy things. So.
I'm Bridget D'Souza. I'm a public school parent here in Jersey City. Before I take care of my 2 kids, that's basically my full-time job. I also write a blog at civicparent.org where I've written quite a bit about property taxes and abatements. I'm a CPA, and I come from a corporate tax professional background.
My name's Amr Kadir. I'm an economist and financial analyst. I work mostly with labor unions, and I've been working with the NGA a little bit on analyzing some of the major districts in the state.
The school funding formula in New Jersey is based off of this idea that every single student has different needs in order to succeed in school. So on the surface, that seems like it makes perfect sense, especially to teachers, students who are English language learners, are going to need different resources than students who are just in general education. And so our student funding formula is a weighted formula. It gives a special weight, so there's a base cost and there's a weight. So you get a base cost for every single student, and then for students who have special needs, that are at-risk students, so that live in poverty, English language learners, and then special education, get extra money to fund those resources that they need in the schools. And then we look at each district, and each district gets an adequacy budget. The adequacy budget is based off of two things, really. It's local revenue and then state revenue. In local revenue, we look at each district and kind of get a sense of what the district can afford to pay. And there's a lot of different things that go into that. And then the state revenue is meant to fill in the gaps. So a high wealth district will be, the state will say that they have to put in more money, and then the state will make up the difference. And then for a low wealth district, they'll say that they have to put in a little bit less, and then usually the state gives them more money. So it's really to even out the playing field for different districts. So, FY18 budget. As many people know, that's been in the news constantly, is this idea that our budget has been flat funded. So even though there has been increases in enrollment, in New Jersey we've seen an increase in student poverty, the budget for schools hasn't increased, which goes completely against the ideas and underpinnings of this of the Jersey budget, of the school funding formula. The only increases are in school choice aid, and then post-district aid, and those go to support charter schools. Specifically, a lot of it is in Newark because of the substantial growth. Most people have not seen an increase in their budget at all. And then there's kind of like this little side of preschool funding, which is outside of the general budget. And I just thought that I would point it out really quickly. Overall, it's been flat funded, just like the district's K through 12 budgets. In Jersey City specifically, there's been a 2.5 decrease. That's just because the state is saying that there's going to be a decrease in preschool students that they're going to fund. Don't think that's really true, but you know, that's how they do their budget. So this is just a timeline of what school aid has looked like for the state. And so there was a cut in 2010-11 at Education Law Center. We went to court and got that money put back in for the Abbott districts. And since then, the governor has basically said, we're just going to keep on funding you at the same rate, very minimal increases, and we're just slightly over what we were at the beginning of the implementation of the school funding formula. And so when you talk about underfunding, the amount of money that the state is supposed to put in, this is what it looks like over the years. It's basically been underfunded by $1 billion across the state since the year after implementation. And so that adds up. And what happens when funding is flat? There's a lot of different things. Obviously, districts and schools are struggling, but especially those districts that see enrollment change and composition change. So there's a lot of districts that have really large ELL populations that weren't getting the funding to begin with, but now as they increase, they're seeing, they're really struggling to kind of play catch up. And then we have, obviously, you have kind of the base costs in terms of educating students, teacher salaries, healthcare, that are continuously increasing, and districts are struggling to pay. And then the other thing is this idea of adjustment aid or hold harmless aid, which I'll go into a little bit later, but it's basically the money that goes to specific districts that once the formula was put into place, they were actually supposed to get less aid from the state. So Governor Christie put in this adjustment aid to keep districts at a certain point. So the SFRA formula says that they're supposed to get one amount. If they were getting more, they have this kind of adjustment aid thing, which I know we'll get into a lot more. So Jersey City specifically, the very top is the adequacy budget. So that is what in total they're supposed to have to support their schools. The second line is the state aid, so that's what the state has been giving them over the years, and then the bottom is the local levy, so that's what the local revenue piece. And this is what they have been putting in. This is not what they're supposed to. We'll talk about a little bit about what is supposed to happen versus what's actually happening. So the adequacy budget is what is supposed to happen, and then the two underneath are what is actually happening. So you can't really get a full scope. We'll go a little bit more in depth about what's happening here. But in terms of the state aid, Jersey City is actually getting more state aid than they're allotted under SFRA. And so when we look at this next slide of cumulative underfunding, we see that they were underfunded for a while. So we see in 2011 there was a big cut, and then it stayed flat, and then actually there's a decrease in the cumulative funding, which is the point where Jersey City actually started getting more than what SFRA says. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that because it gets a little more complicated. But this is the piece that people talk about when they talk about Jersey City, is their local levy. So the local fair share is what the formula says is supposed to go in. So the first one is from 2009, and we see that the local levy is about, it's more than 100 million underneath what it says in the formula Jersey City should be raising. Over the years, that has increased drastically, and Jersey City has not been raising their local levy steadily enough to keep up with that. There's tons of different reasons for that, which I know we'll get into a little bit later, but this is just what it says on the formula. So in terms of adequacy, the very first year that the formula was implemented, Jersey City was actually above adequacy, and then over the years, they have continuously kind of dropped below, with the largest decline being in 2016. And currently, for the FY18 year, we're looking at about $3,000 under adequacy per pupil. So there's all these school funding proposals going on, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about, in specifics, kind of what is going on. I know a lot of people have read about them. But I think the biggest one is this idea of removing adjustment aid. I just wanted to hit on this very, very quickly because a lot of that has to do with what's happening with the formula and not how it's been constructed, but kind of how it's been manipulated by the governor. So the first bar shows proposed state aid, and that goes back to the formula. That goes back to the governor, and he says, this is the money that I want to give Jersey City, or if I'm keeping them flat, this is what I'm going to give them. The second is what the SFRA says, with growth caps, with adjustment aid. So this says, in the formula, if I'm keeping Jersey City flat, this is what they would get. So Jersey City is getting more money from the state than the SFRA formula says that they're supposed to get. The third bar, which I know some people get a little confused with, so please ask me any questions if you want to, is this thing called uncapped aid. So if the formula was implemented the way that it says, without growth caps, without adjustment aid, that is the amount of money from the state that Jersey City would be entitled to. And so when we talk about all of these proposals that are saying they're going to take away adjustment aid, the impact, especially for Jersey City, would be really, really dire in a lot of ways, because they would have to be able to raise that money to keep them at a level that they're at now, and they can't do that the way that the levy is, the rules of the levy is. So you only have 2% increases every year. And so there would be no way if, the Sweeney plan is implemented, that if they take away 20% of the adjustment aid, that they'll even be able to get that back in 5 years. So that is kind of like the takeaway from all of this.
Is that 259 based on the sort of ground up determination of what each student should receive, or is it also impacted by Jersey City's increasing wealth in terms of income? So
it's not, because the thing about the formula is that it actually hasn't been run in a long time. It hasn't been updated. So it's really difficult, and a lot of people are actually having that conversation about Jersey City, is that it needs to be updated. We need to look at what's changing in these places, especially another example is in Hoboken. There's a lot of people saying that we need to go look at what's happening in the districts. It's changed so much since 2009 when you made this formula. And so it's just based off of what is happening in the districts now in terms of student demographic, and is almost getting kind of, for certain districts, it is kind of not related to what's going on the ground at this point anymore. So that's definitely something that needs to be looked at and updated. And there are ways to do that. There's a report that comes out every 3 years that's supposed to look at the funding formula and make sure that everything is kind of still working the way it should. Governor Christie, who doesn't even like the formula, you can only imagine that he doesn't really put too much time and effort into that. So there's a lot of work that could be done, but this is kind of what we're looking at right now.
Great. So, what I wanted to start out, just be a few minutes to go over I'm going to go over sort of a local funding from like a city municipal perspective with sort of a touch point to the school system. So not from the state perspective, looking down, but more from within the city, how do we fund ourselves and how do we fund our school system? So what I wanted to start out with was a look at between 2013 and 2017, what the difference in total city spending has been. And spending is up about 10% on a citywide basis. So most municipalities in the state, they fund their cities with local taxes. Typically the tax levy is the biggest line item in the budget. And the local taxes are simply, you send in your property tax bill, that's the local taxes. In Jersey City, we are unique in that we use pilots, also called abatements, to a much greater degree than most municipalities in the state. We're by far the biggest user of abatements. An abatement is basically it's another funding source for the city. The biggest difference between an abatement and a property tax is that an abatement is, there are actually two factors that differentiate it mostly from a tax. It's a contract, so it is, the terms are written out within the four corners of a contract and then voted on by council. And so terms are set up front in terms of what the abatement recipient will pay over a fixed duration of time. And an abatement contract, a long-term abatement contract, can last anywhere from 10 to 30 years. So we're talking about a generation of in terms of duration. In terms of like thinking about a school child and going from K through 12. So that's the main difference. Number one is that it's a contract. Number two is that an abatement is typically like a fixed payment over time. The taxes, by sort of contrast, taxes can go up in an unforeseeable way. So for instance, the tax rate, the council decides to raise the tax rate because they need more money, they can raise the tax rate and everyone has to pay more in taxes. And so that's just an inherent risk of paying taxes and of owning a home in a municipality, is that your taxes can go up in an unforeseeable nature over time. So in Jersey City, we have a very large number of abatements. As you can see here, we have what this chart is showing is from 2013 to 2017, total revenues in the city budget went up by about $56 million. That was funded about a little over 50% by an increase in pilot fees. And then all other revenues accounted for the balance. So the best way to think about this is that we have contracts that are determined up front that are funding our increases for the city. Now, The second big difference between, I said there are two big differences between an abatement and a tax. The second big difference is that an abatement pays most of the funding from an abatement goes directly to the city. So with a tax, when you write your tax bill, you send in, let's say you send in $100 for your tax bill, let's say that that's what you owe. That then is carved up between the school district, the city, and the county. And the city basically carves that up and then sends out a payment to the school system and a payment to the county, and then they keep the balance. In Jersey City, it's about like a 50%, the city holds about 50%, they give about 25% to the school district, and then about 25% to the county. Those are kind of a rough sort of split. And now contrast that with a pilot payment, it's a 95% cut for the city. So the city takes 95% of the payment, and then 5% goes to the county. And the school district gets nothing. And that is basically a huge exposure for the school system if you're thinking about the fact that the city is funding its own growth with basically that green bar, which is a financial sort of revenue stream of which the school district gets nothing. So another way to look at this paradigm, so to speak, that has grown, by the way, over decades. The use of abatements really started in the late 80s. Use of commercial abatements, I should say, started in the late 80s. And by commercial abatement, I mean luxury high-rises and business buildings like hotels and office buildings that could receive an abatement. Prior to that, in like the mid-80s and prior, abatements were strictly for affordable housing. Now we have a mix of affordable housing, but also commercial buildings like the luxury high-rises, which I just mentioned. In Jersey City, this is basically looking at the split between the tax base and abatement properties. So if you think about all the real estate in the city, some of it is tax exempt, like your government buildings, like school buildings, city halls, cemeteries, hospitals. If a building serves some kind of a public purpose, it can be tax exempt. All the other real estate is subject to some kind of revenue generating potential for the city. It's either taxed by the tax base or it pays a pilot. Now most towns, most municipalities in the state have a lot more blue. They have a lot larger tax base, paying most of the funds into the budget. Jersey City, again, is unique because we have that huge red pie slice. And remember what I said about the abatements. Number one, the 95% of the payment goes to the city, 0% goes to the school system, and the terms are set up front. So, for instance, that big building rising now in Journal Square, that won't pay school tax until 2047 because it's a 30-year abatement, and it was approved in 2013, and it's just now opening in 2017. So for 30 years, that'll be part of that red pie slice, and it'll pay a pilot into the city's coffers, and the school system is guaranteed to get none of that because it's a pilot. This just shows this is just the Fulop administration, which is the last 4 years. Fulop represents, he's kind of been similar to the mayors that preceded him in terms of how he's granted the abatements. Most of the abatements are concentrated downtown. Most of the commercial, let me just actually back up. The abatements that I'm sort of focusing on here in terms of this, most of the revenue potential are the commercial abatements. So your luxury rentals and luxury condo buildings. Also some hotels and office buildings. Most of those are concentrated downtown. Now increasingly what Fulop has done is he's moved some of them into the Journal Square area. So he has moved, sort of incentivized growth in that area of the city. And then also we're seeing more abatements in sort of Bergen-Lafayette area of the city. And then other projects have been granted sort of in other areas of the city, but downtown, Journal Square, and Bergen-Lafayette are still sort of the biggest recipients of these pilots. And what this is showing is that we've had about 34 long-term pilots granted since 2013. And the blue bars simply show the number of units that have been abated. So it gives a sense of the density that is coming in. So for instance, we have about between 3,000 and 4,000 units. So the way I think we need to think about that, these are potentially families or maybe, people who are moving in who may potentially have children that they then send to the school system. So the city is growing itself, which is a great thing. The question is it growing itself in a way that's sustainable for the public schools in the long term? Abatements as a percentage of total city spending. This is simply showing in 2013, abatements funded about 21% of the city budget. By 2017, that number rose to 24%. And so what this is basically showing is that the city is becoming increasingly reliant on pilots, on abatements. Again, two big problems with this. Number one, the abatement terms are fixed, so you can't, it's not like a tax levy where you can, open the spigot a little bit wider and, extract more tax from your tax base. It's not like that. You are fixed to that contract that you agreed upon up front. And then number two, again, the school system is not getting anything from this blue piece of the pie. Now this sort of dovetails into the previous presentation, and I think my biggest concern as a parent, and I'm an accountant, so I just kind of love the numbers because I think they're clarifying. This is the biggest problem as far as I'm concerned, this white space in here. This is an exposure, because what's happening is if the state aid, in the previous presentation we saw that there's a risk that the state aid will go down. Let me just back up. This is this aid from the state. This is the local tax levy, and that's the total budget for the school system. The blue bar shows 2013, and the red bars show 2017. So overall, we can see that the school's budget increased from $660 million in 2013 to about $680 million in 2017. So about a $20 million increase. That increase was funded in part by state aid and also by local taxes. The big concern here is that if this funding source goes down, it will put pressure on the local funding. It will also put pressure on the school system to cut expenses. And that, as a parent, that's my biggest concern, is that our school system, it'll put pressure, and we're seeing it play out in Bayonne. Today there was an article in Kearney about Kearney's school system. It's happened in Patterson. There is a sort of a fixed pie of funding at the state level that is going to be available to us. And so in my big sort of takeaway with this whole discussion is we should be trying as a community to fund our school system locally to the greatest extent possible, so that we have the greatest coverage, so that we're not exposed to the state, to the state withdrawing funding. And one way to do that is to either A, not give as many pilots, or B, take the funding from the pilots and allocate it to the school system.